Midnight, July 17, 1918. In a dusty, cramped basement in the Russian city of Yekaterinburg, a family of 7 is awakened and led downstairs. They are told they are being moved for their own safety and need to have a photograph taken to quell rumors that they have escaped. The father, holding his frail son in his arms, carefully arranges his family. 4 young daughters stand beside their mother, their faces a mixture of confusion and the quiet, ingrained dignity of their upbringing. But this was no ordinary family. The father was Nicholas II, the Tsar of all the Russias. The frail boy was the Tsarevich Alexei, heir to a vast and powerful empire. And the 4 young women were the Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, raised in a world of unimaginable luxury. They were the Romanovs. So how did the absolute rulers of one of the world's mightiest empires end up huddled in a cellar about to face a firing squad instead of a camera? And more importantly, is it true that they all perished that night, or did one of them manage to escape the massacre, giving birth to the most enduring and romanticized mystery of the 20th century? It turns out that when a revolution wants to sever its ties with the past, it doesn't just chop down the tree, it digs up the roots. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where a single, brutal act of annihilation gave birth to an immortal legend. So we have our final chilling image of family huddled in a basement, moments away from annihilation. But this tragedy didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't a sudden random act of violence. It was the final convulsive symptom of a disease that had been festering for decades. To understand why the Romanovs ended up in that cellar, you have to understand the magnificent, contradictory, and terminally ill empire they ruled. You have to look at the crumbling palace right before the revolution kicked in the door. Welcome to Russia in the early 20th century. On a map, it's a sprawling behemoth covering 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. In reality, it was a nation of profound, dizzying contradictions. It had the glittering French-speaking aristocracy of St. Petersburg, with their lavish balls and Fabergé eggs existing in a completely different universe from the hundreds of millions of peasants, most of whom were just a generation or 2 removed from serfdom and living in medieval conditions. The political system that held this fragile construct together was autocracy. And when we say autocracy, we mean it in the most literal sense. The Tsar was not just a king or a president. He was the absolute ruler, his power considered to be granted directly from God. His will was law. There was no real parliament to check his power, no constitution to limit his authority. Think of it as a 300-year-old family business where the CEO believes his business plan was handed down from on high. And any suggestion to change it is not just bad for business, it's blasphemy. This system had worked more or less for centuries, but it was a system built for a medieval world, and it was now colliding head-on with the industrial, political, and social upheavals of the 20th century. The empire's operating system was dangerously out of date, and it was about to suffer a catastrophic crash. At the head of this teetering empire was our main character, Tsar Nicholas II. And herein lies the first tragedy. By all personal accounts, Nicholas was a decent man. He was shy, impeccably polite, and deeply devoted to his wife and children. His private diaries are filled not with grand political ambitions, but with tender notes about family picnics, reading to his children, and the daily weather. He was a man who would have been a perfectly lovely country gentleman, a wonderful husband and father. Unfortunately, he was also the absolute autocrat of 200 million people on the verge of revolution. And for that job, he was catastrophically unsuited. He was indecisive, resistant to change, and possessed a firm, almost mystical belief that he alone knew what was best for Russia, even as all evidence pointed to the contrary. He saw any call for reform not as helpful advice, but as a personal attack on his God-given authority. He was the captain of a ship sailing directly towards an iceberg, convinced that the best course of action was to maintain full speed ahead, because that's what his great-great-grandfather would have done. If Nicholas was the flawed head of state, the heart of the family, and its greatest political liability was his wife, the Empress Alexandra. A German princess and a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she was intensely shy, deeply religious, and viewed by the Russian public with suspicion as a cold foreign influence. Her greatest tragedy, however, was also the empire's. After giving birth to 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, the pressure to produce a male heir was immense. In 1904, she finally did. Tsarevich Alexei was born. The dynasty was secure, but he was born with a terrible secret, a curse passed down through Queen Victoria's bloodline hemophilia. This meant his blood didn't clot properly. A simple bump could cause massive, agonizing internal bleeding. A nosebleed could be life-threatening. The heir to the mighty Russian throne was in essence made of glass. This secret was guarded ferociously, but it dominated the family's private life. Every waking moment for Alexandra was consumed by terror for her son's life. This constant agonizing fear would drive her to seek help from a man who would ultimately seal their doom. When your son is dying and modern medicine has failed, where do you turn? For the desperate Empress Alexandra, the answer came in the form of a wandering Siberian peasant and mystical faith healer, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a magnetic, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a reputation for both divine healing and debauched behavior. Miraculously, or perhaps through a form of hypnotism that calmed the boy and lowered his blood pressure, Rasputin seemed to be the only person who could ease Alexei's suffering during his bleeding episodes. For Alexandra, this was proof of his holiness. He was a man of God sent to save her son. She gave him her absolute, unwavering trust, and this trust gave Rasputin unprecedented access and influence. Soon this strange, often drunk, and notoriously lecherous mystic was advising the Empress not just on her son's health, but on matters of state. Ministers were hired and fired based on his whims. His scandalous late-night parties and rumors of his influence over the Empress became the talk of the nation. It was a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Imagine the situation from the perspective of the average Russian soldier freezing in a trench in World War I, or a mother starving in a bread line in St. Petersburg. They hear that the country is effectively being run by the German-born Empress and her weird mystical party animal of a consultant. It didn't just seem like bad governance, it felt like a betrayal. Rasputin's presence at the heart of the court destroyed the last vestiges of respect and mystique the monarchy had left. He was the living symbol of the rot and decay at the center of the regime. So this is the stage on which our final act will play out. An empire cracking under the strain of war and inequality. A well-meaning but incompetent czar who refuses to see the writing on the wall. A desperate empress consumed by her son's secret illness, and a whole nation that has finally completely lost faith in its divinely appointed rulers. The Romanovs were living in their own cursed chamber long before they were ever locked in that basement. They were prisoners of their own history, their own secrets, and their own catastrophic mistakes. So we have our cast of characters frozen in time at the head of a crumbling empire. We have a well-meaning but fatally incompetent czar, a desperate empress, a fragile heir whose secret illness dictated state policy, and a whole nation simmering with resentment. It was a perfect storm, a political powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a Serbian nationalist's pistol hundreds of miles away in Sarajevo. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 dragged Europe into the First World War, and it would be the beginning of the end for the Romanov dynasty. This is the story of how the family went from the gilded halls of the Winter Palace to the dusty floor of a basement in Siberia. When World War I broke out, Russia was initially swept up in a wave of patriotic fervor. The Tsar Nicholas II saw the war as a holy mission to defend their fellow Slavs. But the initial enthusiasm quickly evaporated against the grim reality of modern warfare. The Russian army, while enormous, was poorly equipped and disastrously led. Soldiers were sent to the front line, sometimes without rifles, and were slaughtered in staggering numbers by the industrial might of the German army. Back home, the economy collapsed. Food shortages led to massive bread lines in the cities. The war effort was draining the lifeblood from an already sick nation. It was at this critical moment that Tsar Nicholas made one of the worst decisions of his entire reign. In 1915, convinced that his divine presence was needed to inspire the troops, he dismissed his top general and took personal command of the army. It was like the CEO of a failing tech company facing a massive cyber attack, deciding to personally write all the code himself. A noble gesture perhaps, but a catastrophic business decision. He knew next to nothing about military strategy, and his presence at military headquarters far from the capital created a massive power vacuum. And who filled that vacuum? His German-born wife Alexandra and her bizarre spiritual consultant, Rasputin. The situation in the capital descended into a chaotic circus. The government began to experience what historians call ministerial leapfrog. Competent ministers were dismissed and replaced by bafflingly inept candidates, often on the recommendation of Rasputin, who claimed to have had a divine vision. It was government policy by way of seance. The rumor mill went into overdrive. To the average suffering Russian, it looked like their country was being run by a German spy and her drunken, lecherous puppet master. The monarchy wasn't just seen as incompetent anymore. It was seen as treasonous and corrupt to its very core. The breaking point finally came in February 1917. It didn't start with a grand political maneuver. It started with women. Thousands of women in the capital, Petrograd, tired of starving while waiting for bread that never came, took to the streets in protest. Soon they were joined by factory workers and students. The protests swelled. Nicholas, still at military headquarters, received reports of the minor disturbances. He dismissed them as a temporary hooligan movement and ordered the army to put them down. But this time, the army refused. The soldiers themselves, weary peasants and workers, broke ranks and joined the protesters. The situation spiraled out of control. The 300-year-old Romanov autocracy didn't collapse with a great battle. It ended with a series of frantic telegrams. His generals and political advisors all sent him the same stark message. It's over. You must abdicate. Realizing he had lost the support of everyone, Nicholas II, the Tsar of all the Russias, signed away his empire on a piece of paper in his royal train car. The family was immediately placed under house arrest in the Alexander Palace. Their world shrank overnight. One day they were demigods, the next, they were the Romanov citizens. Well-kept prisoners in their own luxurious home. The transition was surreal. They were now captives of a revolution they had never truly believed was possible. As the political situation in Russia grew more radical with the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in October 1917, the family's situation became more perilous. They were moved from their comfortable palace deeper and deeper into Siberia, further from any potential rescuers. Their final destination was a merchant's house in the industrial city of Yekaterinburg, a place the Bolsheviks grimly renamed the House of Special Purpose. Here their imperial life was completely erased. The windows were painted over. A high fence was built around the property. They were watched by rough, hostile guards who took pleasure in their humiliation. Yet it was in this final prison that the human side of the family, so often obscured by imperial grandeur, came into full view. Their daily life, as recorded in their diaries, was one of determined, almost heartbreaking normalcy. Nicholas would read aloud to the family in the evenings. Alexandra, in failing health, would busy herself with needlework. The four Grand Duchesses, 22-year-old Olga, the serious maternal one, 21-year-old Tatiana, the elegant and dutiful one, 19-year-old Maria, the good-natured, cheerful one, and 17-year-old Anastasia, the famous mischievous imp, shed their titles and became simply sisters. They took turns caring for their little brother Alexei, whose hemophilia was a constant source of anxiety. They learned to do chores, helped in the kitchen, and tried to keep their spirits up by performing plays for their parents. They were no longer Grand Duchesses who commanded servants with the ring of a bell. They were four young women trying to pass the endless, anxious days, smuggling their little dog into the house and trying to imagine a future that was growing darker by the day. They were living a strangely ordinary family life under the shadow of an extraordinary and terrible fate, completely unaware that in Moscow, their very existence was being debated as a political problem that required a final, brutal solution. They had settled into the bleak routine of their captivity, trying to find normalcy in the ashes of their old world. But they did not know that right beneath their very feet, the cellar of the House of Special Purpose was waiting. It was destined to become not only their tomb, but also the cradle for one of the most haunting legends of the 20th century. So the stage is set. The Romanov family is in the Ipatiev House, the house of special purpose, living a quiet, monotonous life on borrowed time. But who decided that their time was up? And why was the final decision not merely to dethrone a king, but to annihilate an entire family, down to the last child? This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of mob violence. The execution of the Romanovs was a cold, calculated political decision. But to understand it, we need to move beyond the horror of the act itself and into the grim, pragmatic logic of revolution. It's time to open the case file on one of the most consequential murders of the 20th century. The official story, at least the one promoted by the local executioners for years, was one of panicked necessity. The Ural Regional Soviet, the local Bolshevik authority in Yekaterinburg, claimed that the White Army loyal to the Tsar was closing in on the city. They argued that they were faced with the imminent possibility of the Tsar being rescued. A rescued Tsar would be a massive morale boost for the Whites and a devastating blow to the revolution. Faced with this threat, they claimed they had no choice but to act. It's a neat story. It localizes the blame-painting the massacre as a regrettable battlefield decision made under duress rather than a premeditated political assassination ordered from the top. The only problem is, it's almost certainly not the whole truth. Exhibit A, the political necessity of killing a symbol. Let's be clear, by 1918, Nicholas Romanov, the man, was powerless. But Nicholas Romanov, the symbol, was still incredibly dangerous. As long as he or his son Alexei were alive, they were a living banner for the White movement. They were a focal point for every monarchist, every anti-Bolshevik general, and every foreign power that wanted to see the revolution fail. The goal of the revolution wasn't just to change the government, it was to kill the very idea of monarchy. And the most effective way to kill an idea is to kill its living embodiment. For the Bolsheviks, who were fighting a brutal existential civil war for the very survival of their new state, leaving the former Tsar alive was like playing a chess match and leaving your opponent's king on the board out of politeness. It's not just a bad move, it's a strategic blunder that invites you to lose the entire game. The execution of Nicholas was seen as a grim necessity to demoralize their enemies and signal to the world that there was no going back. The old Russia was dead, and they had the body to prove it. This much is cold revolutionary logic. Exhibit B, the doctrine of total annihilation. But killing the Tsar is one thing. Why murder the Empress, the family doctor, the servants, and most chillingly, the 4 daughters and the sick little boy? They held no official claim to the throne. Why was it necessary to be so thorough? The answer lies in the brutal logic of dynastic politics, a logic the revolutionaries understood all too well. They weren't just fighting a war against a man. They were fighting a war against a bloodline. Any surviving Romanov child, particularly one of the Grand Duchesses, would have immediately become the most valuable political pawn in Europe. Imagine if one of the daughters had escaped. She could have been married off to a European prince, creating a powerful rival court in exile. Her children would have had a direct, legitimate blood claim to the Russian throne, a claim that could be used to fuel counter-revolutions for generations. The Bolsheviks had seen their history. They knew how easily new claimants to a throne could appear. Their solution was absolute. It was a brutal form of risk management. They weren't just closing a company. They were shredding all the documents, wiping the hard drives, and salting the earth where the building once stood. No loose ends, no potential for a Romanovs the Next Generation reboot series. The order was to liquidate the entire Romanov firm, and that included everyone from the head of the family down to the teenage son and the young women who carried the family's future in their DNA. Exhibit C, the fateful telegram from Moscow. So who gave the final order? For decades, the official Soviet line was that it was a purely local decision, but most historians now agree that an order of this magnitude killing the former head of state of a major world power would have been inconceivable without approval from the very top, namely Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik central leadership in Moscow. While there is no smoking gun document, no piece of paper with Lenin's signature saying, "Execute the Romanovs," the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Coded telegrams between the local executioners in Yekaterinburg and the leadership in Moscow show a clear line of communication. After the fact, the central government publicly approved of the action. The executioner-in-chief Yakov Yurovsky was clearly acting with the confidence of a man who knew he had backing from on high. In the end, a formal signed order is almost irrelevant. The political climate of the Russian Civil War, the Red Terror that had been unleashed against enemies of the revolution, and the clear strategic benefit of eliminating the Romanovs all pointed in one direction. The men in that basement didn't act alone. They were the bloody tip of a very long spear, one that pointed all the way back to the heart of the revolution in Moscow. When you peel back the layers of political justification and historical debate, you find the true, chilling curse that doomed the Romanov family. It wasn't Rasputin, it wasn't hemophilia, it wasn't even Nicholas's political incompetence. The cursed chamber they inhabited was the lethal combination of absolute power and absolute powerlessness. For 300 years, their family's power was so absolute that it transformed them from mere human beings into living symbols. They ceased to be just a father, a mother, and 5 children. They were the Tsar, the Tsarina, the heir, abstractions representing an entire political and religious order. But when the revolution stripped them of their political power, that symbolic status remained, and it turned toxic. They were now powerless as individuals, unable to save themselves, but they remained incredibly potent as symbols. And because they were symbols of the old world that the revolution needed to destroy, they had to be destroyed too. They were executed not for any specific crime they had committed as people, but for the unforgivable crime of what they were. Their status was their death sentence. They were trapped and ultimately killed by the very myth their dynasty had built around itself. And so, we arrive at the end. After examining the political decay, the family's private tragedy, and the cold logic of revolution, what is our final verdict on the fate of the Romanovs? The conclusion is as clear as it is grim. The execution of Nicholas Alexandra and their 5 children was not a spontaneous act of battlefield justice. It was a premeditated political assassination, sanctioned by the highest levels of the Bolshevik government. It was a brutal strategic act designed to eliminate the living symbols of the old regime and ensure that the monarchy could never be restored. They were killed not for any specific crime they had committed as people, but for the unforgivable crime of what they were. Their family name, which had granted them absolute power for 300 years, became their death sentence. The cursed chamber they inhabited wasn't just the basement of the Ipatiev House. It was their own symbolic identity, from which there was no escape. But the story of what happened after the execution is in many ways just as tragic and revealing. It is a story of how a brutal political act metastasized into one of the most enduring myths of the 20th century. To understand this, we must return to that dark cellar and bear witness to what truly happened. In the dead of night on July 17, 1918, the Romanov family and their 4 remaining loyal attendants were awakened. Their chief executioner, Yakov Yurovsky, told them there was unrest in the town and that they needed to be moved to the basement for their own safety. There was confusion, but no panic. They dressed quietly. Nicholas, ever the father, carried his frail son Alexei in his arms, as the boy could not walk well. The daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia brought pillows with them, and Anastasia, ever the animal lover, carried her small King Charles spaniel, Jimmy. They were arranged in 2 rows in the small, empty basement, told they were waiting for a truck and that a photograph would be taken. Chairs were brought for Alexandra and Alexei. The family waited, their expressions a mixture of weariness and quiet apprehension. Then Yurovsky entered with his squad of executioners. He stepped forward and quickly read a prepared statement. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas turned to his family stunned and managed to utter only, what? Before Yurovsky raised his pistol and fired at him, point blank. What followed was not a clean, swift execution. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. The small basement room erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire and smoke. The executioners each assigned a target, fired wildly. The Tsar and Tsarina died relatively quickly, but the room was so filled with smoke and dust from ricocheting bullets that the shooting became frantic and disorganized. When the initial smoke cleared, the executioners were met with a horrific sight. Several of the children had survived the first volley. The girls particularly seemed almost supernaturally resistant to the bullets. They were huddled against the wall, screaming in terror as the drunken soldiers reloaded. It was then that the executioners realized the source of the miracle. For months, fearing for their future, the Grand Duchesses had painstakingly sewn the family's crown jewels and diamonds into the linings of their corsets and undergarments for safekeeping. This secret final act of preserving their imperial past now became a source of unimaginable horror. The jewels intended to fund a new life instead acted as makeshift bulletproof vests, deflecting the shots and prolonging their agony. The scene descended into a final barbaric frenzy. With bullets proving ineffective, the soldiers waded into the smoke-filled room with bayonets and pistols finishing the wounded, screaming children at close range. It was a savage, intimate, and deeply personal slaughter. The last to die, according to witnesses, was Anastasia, who was cornered against a wall. The family's little dog was killed as well. In the space of 20 minutes, an entire dynasty had been brutally and completely erased. The aftermath was as chaotic as the execution itself. The 11 bodies were loaded onto a truck and taken to a secret location in the woods outside the city. The executioner's initial plan was to throw the bodies down a mine shaft, but the site proved too shallow. In a frantic, 2-day-long ordeal, they retrieved the bodies, attempted to destroy them with acid and fire, and finally buried the majority of them in a hidden, unmarked pit concealed beneath a dirt road. 2 of the smaller bodies, those of Alexei and one of his sisters, were buried in a separate location nearby to confuse any future search. Crucially, the Bolshevik government maintained a strict wall of silence. They publicly announced the death of Nicholas II, the bloody tyrant. But for years, they remained deliberately ambiguous about the fate of Alexandra, and the children claiming they had been moved to a safe location. This official secrecy created a fertile ground for rumors, and into that vacuum of information, a desperate romantic hope began to grow. The story of the execution was so monstrous, so complete in its brutality, that many simply refused to believe it. People needed to believe that innocents could survive, that at least one of them had made it out alive. And the world collectively decided to place that hope on the shoulders of the youngest daughter, the spirited and famous Grand Duchess Anastasia. The myth of the lost princess was born. The legend exploded into public consciousness in the 1920s with the appearance of a woman who became known as Anna Anderson. Pulled from a Berlin canal after a suicide attempt, this mysterious young woman bore a striking resemblance to Anastasia and possessed an uncanny, intimate knowledge of life inside the Russian imperial court. For the next 60 years, she would be the living embodiment of the myth. Her story is a tragedy in its own right. She launched a decades-long legal battle to be recognized as the Grand Duchess. The surviving Romanov relatives were bitterly divided. Some who met her were convinced by her memories and mannerisms. Others denounced her as a clever, mentally unstable imposter. She became a global celebrity, a puzzle that captivated the world. Was she the traumatized survivor of a massacre or a brilliant fraud? For many, it didn't matter. They wanted to believe in her, because believing in her meant believing in a world where fairy tales could just barely survive reality. The myth persisted, fueled by books, plays, and movies for the rest of the 20th century. It was a ghost story that the world refused to let go of. It was science in the end that finally banished the ghost. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the secret gravesite was rediscovered in 1991. The remains of 9 bodies were exhumed. Groundbreaking DNA analysis confirmed beyond any doubt that they belonged to the Tsar, the Tsarina, and 3 of their daughters. But 2 children were still missing: Alexei and one of the girls. The myth, though weakened, still had a flicker of life. That flicker was extinguished in 2007 when archaeologists discovered the second, smaller grave containing the burned remains of a boy and a young woman. DNA testing again provided the final, irrefutable answer. They were Alexei and his sister, Maria. The puzzle was complete. The science was undeniable. Every single member of the Romanov family died in that basement on July 17, 1918. Anna Anderson, who had died in 1984, was also proven by DNA to have been a Polish factory worker, not a Russian princess. The fairy tale was over. So what is the final echo of this story? It is a profound reflection on the nature of truth, myth, and memory. The murder of the Romanovs was so total, so absolute in its cruelty that for decades the world refused to believe it. The Anastasia myth persisted for so long not because the evidence for it was strong, but because the truth of the alternative was simply too unbearable to accept. We invented a survivor because we could not cope with the reality of 5 innocent children being systematically slaughtered in a cellar. The legend was a shield against a horrifying truth. Nicholas II was by most measures a failed autocrat whose incompetence helped lead his country to ruin. But he was also a loving husband and father who died trying to comfort his family. The children were completely heartbreakingly innocent. They were born into a gilded cage and were murdered for a political game they never had a chance to understand. The ultimate legacy of the Romanovs is one of tragic transformation. In life, they were symbols of a dying political order. In the decades after their deaths, they became symbols of a great historical mystery. And today, canonized as saints and passion bearers by the Russian Orthodox Church, they have become symbols of faith and innocent suffering. Their story reminds us that history is not just about the cold facts of politics and power, but about the deeply human stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of the unthinkable. What do you think is the most tragic part of the Romanov story, the political failure or the human cost? Let us know in the comments. Some chambers in history are not just cursed by ambition, but stained by a tragedy that time can never truly wash away.